For March, you have chosen the spiritual, he never said a mumbling word. Um, and you've written about this at CPR.org on our website on the classical page. You use the phrase suffering in silence, or suffering and silence, as you've explained. How come?
Oh, that story of Jesus at the cross, being crucified, so I mentioned earlier that the spirituals take into account the Christian witness. That's my theological training showing forth the biblical witness. And it tells the story of how Jesus suffered on the cross with pretty much only what a lot of Christians would say were 7 sayings. On Good Friday, many Christian churches will have a Good Friday service where they celebrate the 7 last words, which is really the 7 last sayings on the cross. So outside of those things, many of them Jesus goes on to say, or the Bible goes on to say, he said this to fulfill scripture. He did this so that, this thing can be recorded and people could recognize he is the fulfillment of what was said in Hebrew scripture. So I think outside of those things, for instance, when he was being interrogated, if you would, by Pilate, he very much said nothing. And when he did respond, the people say, you are the king of the Jews. What do you say? He said, well, it is you who say that. I'm not saying that. I'm not claiming any of those things. So pretty much he never came to his defense. He didn't say anything. For most of that period, once he was arrested, he said nothing. On the cross, with the exception of those few sayings, he said nothing. And therefore, the slave community interpreted that he was suffering, but he didn't say he said nothing, not even a mumbling word. He suffered in silence. And for me, it's the juxtaposition, not only suffering in silence, but the suffering and the silence. The suffering, his silence, but the silence of those who could have come to defend him and didn't. So there's that silence. Martin Luther King says that when we go down this road of injustice, we will remember those who said nothing. The silence becomes deafening, those who didn't come to speak on our behalf, especially the religious community who said nothing. And even today, I would argue and say that there is not enough outrage from the church about what goes on in terms of racial injustice. There is some, but not to the level that it really, because it goes against Christian teaching. So when I think this, he never said a mumbling word. There's this synergy, there is this resonance with the enslaved community where they're saying his suffering reminds me of my suffering, where I'm being beat in broad daylight in the community. The rest of the slave community is watching as massa is whipping me and beating me. And it's not that there was much really the slave community could have done, because if they jumped in, if they were to have overcome the slave master, their lives eventually would have been forfeit, because the Southern slave community and institution would not have brooked that. And we see whenever there was a slave uprising, it was met with deadly violence, So what is one left to do except to I don't want to say grin and bear it, that would not be accurate, but to suffer in silence, and I wrote in the article that I think one of the reasons, and there's some documentation to bear this, that they did not cry out, if they could, withhold and hold their pain, those cries within themselves, is because to do so on some level, the slave masters and the overseers that beat the slaves, they derived pleasure from this. They enjoyed it. It was gratuitous pain and in the inflicting of suffering. And so I think that many of those who were enduring this kind of suffering, this pain and tribulation, they held in their pain so that they didn't add to the pleasure of those who were inflicting the suffering upon them. And I think that's where they felt vindicated in some regard, because if they beat Jesus and he endured this suffering, then, which was unjust, then I too can endure this and realize that just as Jesus eventually overcame this death on a cross, then I will be able to overcome this situation of slavery and the suffering. And whether I get my freedom in death, or I get my freedom from emancipation, or I get my freedom from taking matters into my own hands and just running, this is going to resolve itself, you know.
Talk to us about the significance of that message today.
Oh, that is so deep. It's, you know, we so many the pain of the African American community in many ways. I think as we began talking today, I talked about the fact that we are still enduring a lot of that suffering and indignity. One of the physical atrocities committed against the the enslaved African community during the period of slavery, in addition to the beatings, was lynching. And lynching did not cease after emancipation. The South continued to lynch Black bodies way up until the middle of the 20th century. And small remnants still exists today. It was only a few years ago, there were reports in the New England states on college campuses where people would hang nooses outside college students' doors. Even during this event on January 6th, there was a noose erected in front of the Capitol. So we know this is still a remnant of the South. This thing about, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, you're also referencing the fact that some of the text of the spiritual "He Never Said a Mumbling Word" is connected to, has been extrapolated to being connected to lynchings as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a song written, if I have this correct, Abel Bearpool, I might have the name incorrect, but the author of Strange Fruit. And he, a New Yorker who was a Russian Jewish immigrant. And it's about the lynching of Black bodies. So the strange fruit is Black bodies hanging from these trees in the South. The imagery alone of that is just startling and gut-wrenching. And so when we're talking about lynching, how you frame the Black body as something to be, dealt with, to disposed of in this horrific manner is just, one of the worst atrocities in our country's history. James Cone, theologian, makes the correlation of lynching with the cross. He wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. This idea of attaching a body to a piece of wood to assassinate, to kill it, to murder this body by attaching it to a piece of wood. And so when I think about today, just last year, our country was reeling from what many have called a public lynching in the death of George Floyd. It was a turning point for what many have also called the pandemic within the pandemic. Mm-hmm. When we see that a Black body who I think still to this day, many white folks in our country still don't believe that the things that Black people have been talking about in terms of police brutality, how I've been stopped, I've been treated unjustly, police just have this gratuitous violence, which is unjust. And it's always very often met with this sense of disbelief and a sense of exaggeration. This can't be so. But in front of not only the entire country, but the entire world, we saw George Floyd being pinned on the ground with a policeman's knee on his neck for some odd 8 minutes and 46 seconds. What is that except for a lynching, where you, instead of a noose, you use your knee and you suffocate a Black living being to the point of asphyxiation and no breath until breath leaves the body. So whenever you physically accost and deprive a Black body physically in that manner of life, it's a lynching. That's what it is. And so if we use, or if we look at that spiritual, he never said a mumbling word, even though Black people are protesting, when our voices are not heard and being silenced, it's the same thing. It's like suffering in silence because nobody is hearing. And so our voices are muted. Nobody's hearing the suffering. And even though we might be talking, it's like pressing the mute button on your remote.
And Roger Holland, I really want to thank you for taking time again today, for your leadership, and for your musical expertise in walking us through these experiences that are a part of history, an important part of history. And you who are watching, Roger has written about this on our website. Again, each month, a different spiritual, a new article. You can read about it on the classical page at cpr.org and listen for beautiful versions of this spiritual this month. He never said a mumbling word on CPR Classical, on Sing every Sunday morning with David Ginder, and then throughout the month as well. Thank you, Roger.